The old man sat quietly in his living room, staring at the glow of the television. It was a warm April evening in Citrus Heights, California, in 2018. Outside, kids rode bikes and dogs barked at sprinklers. Inside, Joseph James DeAngelo, 73 years old, with thinning grey hair and a face that hid decades of secrets, heard a sudden knock on the door. He froze. For a moment, everything went still. The only sound was the faint hum of his refrigerator. When he opened the door, two men in plain clothes stood there. They weren't selling anything, and they weren't his neighbors. The shorter one flashed a badge. "Mr. DeAngelo," he said calmly, "we'd like to ask you a few questions." DeAngelo's eyes flicked between their faces. He didn't speak. His hand trembled slightly. The officers already knew. They had his DNA. The result was 100% certain. After 40 years of terror, the man known as the Golden State Killer, the predator who had broken into homes, tied up families, and left behind trails of fear across California, was finally caught. And the key that cracked the case wasn't a fingerprint, or a confession, or a lucky break. It was a DNA test. A simple genealogy match. After decades of dead ends, one drop of blood and a few strands of old hair had finally revealed the face behind the mask. As the officers cuffed DeAngelo's trembling hands, he muttered something under his breath, his voice low and strange. "I did all those things," he whispered. "I didn't have the strength to stop." The room went silent. The air felt heavy, almost sacred, like history was happening right there. That night, when the news broke, the country erupted. 40 years. More than a dozen murders. 50 rapes. Over 100 break-ins. All committed by one man who had vanished without a trace. And now, because of a DNA test uploaded to a public genealogy website, his name had been found. But how did it happen? How did a small digital clue in a family tree bring down one of America's most terrifying killers? The story began long before that night. It was the mid-1970s, in a quiet neighborhood in Sacramento. Back then, people left their doors unlocked. Kids played on front lawns until sunset. The air smelled of cut grass and freedom. But that peace was about to shatter. In 1976, a woman named Jane Carson was sleeping next to her husband when she woke up to the sound of footsteps. The light from the hallway flickered under the bedroom door. She thought maybe it was her cat. But then the door creaked open, and she saw a man wearing a ski mask, holding a flashlight and a gun. "Don't move," he whispered. Her heart stopped. He tied up her husband, then turned toward her. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "I just want money," he said, but Jane could feel something else, something much darker, behind his words. He assaulted her, then vanished into the night. That was the first of many. The police began calling him the East Area Rapist. He attacked couples, always sneaking in at night. He'd tie up the man, stack plates on his back, and whisper, "If I hear these plates fall, she dies." People in Sacramento started locking their doors. Men stayed awake at night holding baseball bats. The fear spread like wildfire. Then, suddenly, he disappeared. For years, there was nothing. Until bodies began turning up hundreds of miles south, in Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange County. This time, the crimes were different. Brutal. Deadly. Investigators didn't realize it yet, but the same man had changed his hunting grounds, and his name. The press called him the original Night Stalker. But decades later, when detectives pieced it all together, they realized something chilling. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same man. The Golden State Killer. And for over 40 years, he'd managed to escape every single lead. Until 2018. That year, a small team of cold case investigators decided to try something new, something no one had ever done before. They had an old DNA sample from one of the crime scenes, preserved since the 1980s. Using it, they created a digital DNA profile and uploaded it, not to a criminal database, but to a public genealogy website called GEDmatch. The kind people use to find long-lost cousins or learn about their ancestry. At first, the computer returned only distant matches, fourth cousins, maybe fifth. But that was enough. They began building family trees, tracing relatives one by one, searching for men who fit the right age, the right area, and the right background. The work took months. Then, one evening, an investigator named Paul Holes looked up from his computer screen. He had found a link, a genetic trail leading to a small family line in California. One of them had been a police officer in the 1970s. A man named Joseph James DeAngelo. They couldn't believe it. The killer had been hiding in plain sight all along. But they needed proof. Real proof. So they followed D'Angelo for days, watching him shop, watching him drive, watching him take out his trash. One afternoon, he threw a tissue into a public garbage can. That tissue would change history. It was taken to a lab. The DNA was extracted, tested, and compared to the decades-old sample from one of the Golden State Killer's scenes. When the results came back, the room went silent. It was a perfect match. 40 years of mystery, over. But as the detectives sat there, staring at the report, a strange chill went through the room. Because now that they knew who he was, they had to face the terrifying truth. This man had lived among them. He had shopped at the same grocery stores, driven the same roads, even waved at neighbors. And no one ever suspected him. That night, when they surrounded his house, every officer knew this wasn't just another arrest, it was the end of an era of fear. But no one knew what D'Angelo would do. He was an ex-cop, trained and dangerous. As the SWAT team prepared to move in, one officer whispered, "If he comes out armed, it's over." They crept toward the front door, flashlights cutting through the dark. Inside, D'Angelo sat still, listening. He had heard the engines outside. The faint crunch of boots on gravel. He stood up slowly, walked to the window, and peeked through the blinds. Red and blue lights flashed. For the first time in 4 decades, the hunter realized he was the one being hunted. The officers kicked down the door. "Joseph James D'Angelo. You're under arrest for the murders of..." Before they could finish, D'Angelo raised his hands. His voice was calm, almost emotionless. "I have a roast in the oven," he said quietly. "I can't leave it to burn." Everyone froze. No one said a word. The man who had terrorized California for years was talking about dinner. As the handcuffs clicked, one detective whispered, "You've run out of time, Joe." And for the first time, D'Angelo didn't answer. He just stared at the floor. The DNA test had done what hundreds of officers, decades of investigation, and countless sleepless nights could not. It had unmasked a monster. But as the officers drove him away, one question still hung in the air. How many others had there been? And what else was he hiding? Outside, as the police lights flickered through the neighborhood, a woman across the street whispered to her husband, "He used to fix our bikes." No one slept that night. Because in that quiet California town, the past had finally come knocking. And it wasn't done yet. The morning after Joseph James D'Angelo's arrest, California woke up to headlines that felt almost unreal. Golden State Killer caught after 40 years. DNA links ex-police officer to 12 murders. People stared at their screens, coffee cups trembling in their hands. Across the state, survivors of the attacks, those who had lived in fear for decades, burst into tears. Some cried because justice had finally come. Some cried because they never thought it would. In Sacramento, Jane Carson, one of the earliest victims, sat in her kitchen holding the newspaper. Her hands shook as she read the name. Joseph D'Angelo. It didn't sound like a monster's name. It sounded like the man who might have lived next door. She whispered to herself, all these years. Her husband placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Neither spoke for a while. The phone rang non-stop that morning at the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office. Reporters, survivors, even retired officers who had once chased the phantom known as the East Area Rapist. Detective Paul Holes, who had spent years chasing the ghost through cold case files, sat at his desk, his eyes red from sleepless nights. He had dreamed of this moment for years. And yet, when it came, he didn't feel triumph. He felt something else, something heavier. He thought about all the faces in those old case photos. The families who never got answers. The women who had been too scared to sleep for decades. When Holes finally saw D'Angelo in person, he was stunned. The man was small, quiet, almost fragile-looking. Wrinkled hands, tired eyes. The kind of man you'd pass by in a grocery store without a second glance. But beneath that frail shell was the mind of a predator. That day, they began questioning him. D'Angelo said almost nothing. He sat in silence, eyes fixed on the table. Every now and then, he muttered something under his breath, softly, as if arguing with himself. Detectives noticed it immediately. "Did you hear that?" one whispered. "His talking to someone." Later, when they reviewed the recordings, they heard him whispering strange phrases. "I didn't want to do those things," he said. "Jerry did." Jerry. Who was Jerry? Investigators later believed D'Angelo might have been talking to an imagined alter ego, the other side of himself that he used to excuse his crimes. It made their skin crawl. Meanwhile, news cameras crowded outside his quiet suburban home. Reporters described the scene: neat lawn, tidy driveway, flowers blooming by the door. The neighbors were in shock. "He was so normal," one woman told a reporter. "He used to wave every morning. He'd go fishing on weekends." Another neighbor said, "Sometimes I heard him yell late at night. I thought maybe he was watching sports." No one had suspected a thing. Inside his house, police found boxes, old tools, ropes, a gun, bits of clothing, even shoelaces tied into strange knots. They found things that didn't belong to him.